Well, I believe there would be no better way to end this journey than with a panel of this caliber. So let me start by welcoming all of you, and particularly a long-standing friend of Mexico, President Bill Clinton. It's an honor, President Clinton. And also very good friends of Mexico, the President of the International Development Bank, Luis Alberto Moreno, and the President of Laureate International, Doug Becker. We will get right into the issues because whom you want to hear is them and not me. So I'll just try to facilitate some of the interactions between this distinguished set of panelists. The issue has been youth and productivity, and we will talk about it with their perspectives. So let me ask President Clinton, if you allow me, Mr. President, a question that probably is going to be of much help to put into a appropriate framework this important interaction. As we've heard this morning, and we were just listening to the conclusions, technical educations and skill training can improve not only productivity, but social mobility, which is as important. And as you have been involved with this issue, among many others, I would like to ask you, what type of things, President Clinton, you have found help to promote this combination of technical education, skills training, and how can we move about it? How can we move from making a statement with which we all agree and making it happen?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to be here and for the work that is done by all of you in the audience. To answer the question, I think it's important to focus on two big things that are rarely mentioned in Mexico, because bad news is always better news than good news. But there are two trend lines worth noting, which is that in the last decade, when inequality was getting worse everywhere in the world, before Brazil had its slowdown, it appears from all the data I've seen that Mexico and Brazil were two of the only rising countries in the world where inequality actually was reduced. Secondly, when all this debate goes on in America over immigration reform and immigration policy, I always remind people, especially those who disagree with me, that we've had no net in-migration from Mexico for the last 4 years. And I believe it is because of the dramatic increase in the number of people going higher in education and training, going into post-high school education and getting their degrees or certificates. So you want to know how you can do better. And the short answer is that we have to make sure that as more people get good educations and their incomes rise, that we never allow an artificial barrier to be constructed between academic education and education which prepares people to get good jobs and earn good incomes. And if you look at, I'll skip the U.S. We did well, then we didn't do so well, now we're doing a little better again on this. But if you look at the German system, for example, they have the highest percent of GDP in manufacturing of any advanced economy, the highest percent of GDP in exports of any advanced economy. And even though the overall wealth of America is greater. The people who work in technically related jobs in Germany do about as well as anyone in the world. And it is because they have very good apprenticeship programs where the employers of all sizes work very closely with the education and training institutes. And because the universities try to both promote academic advancement and practical knowledge and employability, kind of like you do, Doug. And I think anything you can do to improve the degree to which that happens is a good thing. If you look at the most successful places in the U.S. for job placement, income growth, and social mobility, it's a very mixed picture, but we're a big, diverse country. They are largely places where there is a total integration of the university with the local community. I'll just give my favorite example is Orlando, Florida. The third biggest undergraduate institution in the United States, although almost no one knows it, is the University of Central Florida. In Orlando, they have more than 50,000 students. And they have grown so much in large measure because they are surrounded by 100 computer simulation companies, actually more than 100 now. And that's because it's the home of Disney World. And to make it interesting, you have to have computer simulation. So our space agency, NASA, and the Defense Department together spend $5 billion a year there because it's cheaper to teach someone to drive a tank or pilot a jet plane or send a spaceship up on a simulator than on the real thing. And so a video game company, Global Entertainment Arts, moved their whole headquarters there because video games in particular need better computer simulation. So we get all these professors to come in. They're all given leave if they want to go out and start companies. Under the law in America, if you get federal money to do research and you can turn it into something that makes money, the university gets to keep the money. So we have this seamless relationship between higher education and the economy, and as a result, the unemployment rate is below the national average, the income is above the national average, and the social mobility for the families who have people that are the first people in their family ever to get an education is quite high. But the Germans attempt to do this in every community, in every sector of the economy, in a very sophisticated way. And I think the countries that do the best job of this are likely to have the highest growth rates combined with more broadly shared prosperity. And you really ought to go back, all of you, if you haven't studied the numbers, and look at the data which indicates that before the recent slowdown in Brazil in particular, and then Mexico is going to be hit by the oil price drop, that both Mexico and Brazil seem to have successfully reduced income inequality. In Brazil, it was almost certainly because of the Bolsa Familia program, of which you have a more modest version here. But in Mexico, I think it was because of higher education, because of the way you've done it, the things you've already done right. And so I think I'd look for everybody that you think might be doing it better and figure out how to do it here.
Thank you, Mr. President. Luis Alberto Moreno, of course you know the region, Latin America, very well, at depth, I would say. From your perspective, how do you compare the region with the rest of the world? We've talked about the German model, of course, the experience in the US, perhaps other models in Europe and in Asia. So where does Latin America stand compared with those countries that have advanced until a very interesting degree?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, and it's an honor to be here and to be with people who are really concerned about the most important issue related to social mobility, as President Clinton was describing. The short answer to your question is that we're not good. If you compare the so-called PISA scores, which are done at, everybody knows in the audience, Latin America ranks in the lowest tier of all countries in the world. Having said that, there are countries that have begun to advance in a very interesting way. And Brazil is actually, President Clinton was talking about Brazil, is a very interesting example. And you know, movements in scores in countries of the size of Mexico, of the size of Brazil are very difficult. It's much easier to do it in a country like Panama with 3 million people. And that's why it's no surprise that you find Finland always in the top scores, largely because it's a smaller country. So really getting to something like this, and what Brazil did was to begin to put a set of measurements that are taken not at the federal level, but from the federal level to the state level to the local level. And actually there are reviews done regularly, and there is a real race to the top done by states in Brazil, which you have states like Minas Gerais and others who began to rank high, and this is a way for, politically very important for the governor of that state to show that they're advancing. Now, I'm very glad that you're talking here about the nexus to productivity, because if there is one issue in Latin America that we really need to change, is precisely productivity. If you look at the last 20 years, and all the numbers on, of all countries in Latin America, there's few exceptions, the productivity rates are basically have been flat. It's been the case of Mexico, it's been the case of Colombia, totally flat. And certainly, because of that, our rates of growth are limited. If we had, for instance, the levels of productivity the United States has, Latin America would be growing at twice the rate we currently are growing. So this is at the center of the public policy debate. And as you look at this, certainly the whole connection that President Clinton was describing of connecting skills and to the workforce, which is basically the essence of the German model. We've done programs where we basically look at ways of how to do internships in companies and at the same time courses of training. And the results are that immediately the students that go through those programs at whatever level of schooling, not only you see drops in crime rates, because typically what we have in Latin America is a very high unemployment rate in young people, but you equally see a very high likelihood of students getting jobs. It was said here before that, you know, in Latin America we don't look much at the traditional technical jobs, but rather we love doctors, lawyers, economists, and we have a lot of them. But the reality is that a lot of these professions will be new professions in the future, because we are at a moment of the biggest technological change that we have ever seen. And that big technological change that is taking place is largely a technological change that will help individual people have higher productivity. No longer, if you have a factory which is managed by a robot that is planned by a high-end kind of engineer, in 5 or 10 years' time, it will be done by a very basic operator. So all of this technological change, as it raises people's, individuals' capacity of production, is going to put an even further challenge to the way we think of education. And this is where I think the space for technical education should be at the center. I know, for instance, President Obama today is inaugurating one of these community colleges that precisely looks at this nexus. And I think this is a great example of what the US has done. Few people talk about it, but I am absolutely convinced that community colleges where you marry the talents of a particular community with its the demands from its business community and the type of production that exists is extremely important. You have here developed in Mexico a cluster of aeronautics that never existed before. And you have a university right next to it that's been training high numbers of engineers. So these, I think, are the things that we see. And also in Brazil, as President Clinton was mentioning, in one of the poorest states, the state of Ceará, we developed a program at the bank that basically looks at the socio-emotional skills for the poorest. Again, because people need to be trained in leadership, in ways to adapt, to be better when they come into the workforce.
Thank you, Luis Alberto. Doc, you have facilities in 26 countries, I believe, even more than that. Well, so you have also a very interesting perspective, and of course, you've done a lot of work in this issue of training for new skills, which is, to the educational systems, is something that may be relatively new, and we don't exactly get what's the best way to get there. So from your perspective and on your experience and what's happening in one country and not in others, what kind of curriculum changes you suggest for achieving this as a standard within the higher education institutions?
Thank you, Juan Ramon, for the question. And also, I don't want to miss the chance to thank you for the work you've done to help us organize this whole conference today, to thank Luis for his attendance and the support of his team, and especially to thank President Clinton. I mentioned as we were coming out on this stage that it's hard to believe that only 5 years ago I had the chance to ask President Clinton to become the honorary chancellor for Laureate, and almost exactly 5 years ago, his first visit to a Laureate University in his new capacity was not only to UVM, it was on this stage. So it's really great timing. And when I think about the link between education and social mobility, I have to say just the opportunity, President Clinton, to have your support, it comes from that point. I remember when I sat with you and asked you to consider taking this role, it was the role that Laureate was playing in lifting people into the middle classes that caused you to want to support our work. When I see the great work of the IFC and the fact that they are an investor in Laureate, they're not an investor in Laureate from a commercial perspective. They're an investor in the work that we're doing to reduce inequality and boost social mobility. So, and when we have the chance to enjoy the support and engagement of the IDB, it's because the work that we're doing is important. So when I look out at the audience and I see this extraordinary mix of business and government leaders and educators and students, everyone is here and focused because of the importance of this topic. We all agree. What we may not always all agree on is how to make it better. And often, President Clinton, you talk about how important the how question is in what we do. So I will very briefly try to divide my thoughts between the things that Mexico could do that are similar to the rest of the world, and then one specific thing that is very unique to Mexico. First, I think there is a huge advantage to having a diverse system of both public and private universities. Now, I don't just say that because we're in the field of operating private universities. I say that because the evidence proves that there's a benefit on both sides. And in fact, the two countries that you mentioned earlier, President Clinton, Mexico and Brazil, both would be notable for having a very diverse, balanced mix of public and private in their system. I don't believe that a country would be well served to have only private education. And I know it wouldn't be well served to have only public education. One of the advantages of private education is that private institutions, if they're doing their job right, tend to be very close to private industry. And private industry gives us that virtuous effect you were describing in Orlando, for example. If Disney brings computer graphics and simulation, and then the government says, well, that's where the talent is, let's open a research laboratory, and then the university feeds the mix, you need that involvement of industry. Maybe 50 years ago or 30 years ago, when most university graduates went to work for government, or for government-owned enterprise, maybe that wasn't so important. But today, it's really, really important. So have a diverse system. The second thing that I think is very important is we need to think about what access means. It's not just about affordability. The part of the access needs to be making it easier to get on the ladder towards skills and achievement. If you have a situation like we have here in Mexico, where the basic rung on the ladder is the licenciatura, then that's 4 years of investment of people's time and money to become on their way towards an education. The advantage of technical vocational education that you were mentioning, Luis, earlier, is that it gives people the chance to get skills and get to work sooner. But it doesn't mean that they have to stop there. They can take that example of the U.S. community college. The beauty of the system is it's intended to be a 2-year experience that then gives you a path to more credentials throughout the rest of your life. And now the expression people use is stackable credentials, certificates, programs, diplomas, and degrees that earn you towards a higher and higher level of skill and attainment. I think this is really an important part of accessibility. And when I say I wanted to be specific to Mexico, I have to say Mexico has so many strengths in its education system, but this is one area where Mexico really is not even present. The percentage of students that participate in technical vocational education is much lower than any country where I operate and where I'm used to. And I was very interested in the comments of the governor of Querétaro when he was mentioning the importance of technical education because of the technology-driven employment that's happening in his state. And I can see where the need for organizations like ours to lean in and support that. The advantage of a university doing technical vocational, it shouldn't, in my mind, be separated, is that students then have the chance to progress. They do their 1 year or 18-month entry program, but they get credit towards what in Mexico is a highly sought-after credential, which is the licenciatura. So those are some thoughts, Juan Ramon.
Very good. Thank you very much, Doug. So there seems to be, of course, an agreement that we all need a better prepared workforce. Because as President Clinton has said, this means not only better income for families, but it also means better health and better education for newer generations, and most important, better development, not only at individual, but also at community level, a development more even, less unequal, which is, of course, one of the major social concerns in Mexico. President Clinton, how do we go about bringing together more closely the institutions of higher education and the employers? What role is for this to play by the government? What role is for it to play by communities? How would you guide us to bring this very important union more effective than we have achieved so far?
Well, I don't know that I'm the best person to answer that, but I think that every institution that exists should have an advisory council that reflects the way the real economy works in the area. And in the places where there are a lot of poor people, there needs to be a strategy to diversify the economy. I'll tell you some good news about Mexico that we're debating in America. No one knows yet. Many people believe that this information technology revolution has reached a point in the wealthiest areas that now it will always eliminate more employment on the downside than it will create on the upside. You may have noticed that Carlos Slim said a few months ago that he thought one day everybody in every rich country would be on a 3-day work week. And we could have a very nice life and earn the same amount of money because technology would make us all so productive. If you live in Chiapas, that seems a long way away, right? So I think that's good for Mexico. That means that, to go back to what Luis said, anything you can do to increase productivity here, I promise you, will create more jobs than it costs, and will drive the wage structure up because the work will be worth more. So the other thing that I think you should really look at is how can you do more distance learning and make sure there are economic opportunities on the other side of that. I'll give you just one example that's something that works pretty well in America. Cleveland, Ohio was once a great industrial city, and then it was devastated. I mean, nothing. It was awful. And then the Cleveland Clinic became one of the great medical institutions in the world. But most of the people in their working years were not qualified to go to work there. So it was growing like crazy, but nobody got a job there. That is, all these young people came in to take the jobs because they were computer literate or trained in basic science or technology. So they went to the local institution of higher education there, which was a community college, and they said, we will fund a study to tell us, no matter what happens to America's healthcare law, which job categories will grow in number with the aging of the baby boomers and all these other things that are going to happen. We know nothing can stop it. There'll be a greater demand. And so they did. They got the results. There were 5 of them. And then they ran ads all over Cleveland, on television, in the papers, everywhere, saying, if you will come to our college and you will take one of these 5 things and you get certified or you get your degree, we promise you a job and here is your starting salary. So you all of a sudden had all these 45-year-old people who've never been involved in anything before showing up and training in something entirely new. And the educational institutions were able to basically diversify the economy by matching a supply with the nearest demand. If there's not one, then you have to do distance learning. You have to do a sort of hypercharged version of the Khan Academy in America, which has. But there are a lot of things to be done in really poor areas in Mexico where there are, basically agricultural now, and it wouldn't be economical for Doug to go put a campus there, but you can still create a different economy. You just have to work at it, and I think in the process of doing so, you'll be connecting even more people to the rest of the world through the internet, and their children will do things that will amaze them. I mean, I tell everybody the great thing about the modern world is an 8-year-old anywhere in any country can get on the internet and find out things in 30 seconds I had to go to university to learn. The bad thing is that includes learning how to make a roadside bomb. But it's true, that basically all the barriers that used to keep us apart mentally and physically now look a lot more like nets than walls. And because Mexico has made this commitment to education, as Doug said, both public and private, and because there are models all around the world about what works best to increase worker productivity, I think if there ought to be a plan not only to extend it in this state where you could physically reach everybody, but throughout the country. And I believe it can be done. I spend a lot of my time in really, really poor places. And I haven't been anywhere where there wasn't a fairly significant number of opportunities to diversify the economy if you could train the people to do the jobs and get the capital investment there.
So that's something to keep in mind at any time when we discuss development. Luis Alberto, President Clinton has just mentioned the importance of distance education. Are we fully using it in Latin America? Has it been an effective inclusion tool for those groups that had been historically margined from the system?
I think, as President Clinton likes to say, you always find amazing cases, individual cases, of tremendous innovation in education just about everywhere. The big challenge is how to do it not for 1,000 students, but for 1 million students. And here is where it's very difficult to really do the kind of innovation that you're suggesting. We, for instance, here in Mexico, we're just talking with the Secretary of Education. We're doing 2 types of programs. What's called the Escuela Digna, and another program precisely focused on the rural areas. And the solutions to the rural areas necessarily have to go with technology hand to hand. Why? Because it's difficult to get there, and more importantly, it's difficult to get good teachers to go into these rural areas. So here, the combination of technology is good. But let me give you some examples. edX, which is this platform of so-called massive online courses, where it was basically created by MIT and Harvard and a group of universities. the amount of students around Latin America going on massive online courses is huge. Are they getting better educated? I think we still probably have to measure a lot of the impact. But it shows you the appetite. We, for instance, are now part of this network because we do a lot of public service type training, people who are experts on taxation in a state or local government. And we used to train, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people a year. Now it's massive, and it's having a tremendous impact. So that use of technology is hugely important. The other one is working with teachers. We have an amazing program that was done in Ecuador talking about the quality of teachers, especially those that go outside into rural areas. What they did was to have a video of the very best teachers in the country, in different regions of the country. And then they, in turn, sit down with other teachers to basically create kind of the space in which teachers are teaching other teachers. And they have a whole system of promotion that has become extremely successful. So there is a lot of areas where there is a marriage of technology that necessarily has to have hand in hand with the teacher quality and what happens inside the classroom, which is the other part that we are doing here in Mexico, which is supporting the improvement of schools in the so-called Escuela Digna, but in things like what is the design of the modern classroom. We, Cantinflas, which is this great value of Latin Americans, used to teach us all of how ridiculous were many things that happen in the classroom. And these are exactly the kinds of things that we need to change. So I think there is a whole space there's, for instance, cases of one classroom school in some rural areas where you have different age students, and actually, even if they're older students or younger students, those who are more advanced carry the rest. So these are the kinds of I think, innovations that we should be mindful of. And certainly, if one looks at the poverty in Latin America, it's precisely concentrated in the rural areas because there is all this lack of public goods, from roads to electricity to water and sanitation. And this is what creates this difficulty for countries like ours, which increasingly are more and more in the so-called middle income trap. This is one of the areas that we need to change.
If I could just say one thing to follow up. I agree with everything Luis said. But the description he just gave you of what's going on now, there are a lot of these young people all over Mexico who live in small towns or rural areas, and they're smart and gifted, and they'll get whatever they can get online, and they'll come to Mexico City or some other city and start their way up the ladder. They'll do fine. If you want, however, to have more balanced growth and you think it will be more manageable to not have everybody living in a city, then you have to have some outreach to where people are. You have to either have, if you have just available capital for small business formation, a lot of people will choose to live where they live, even if they do all their business online, or create a business where they are. And we do a lot of work in Africa in places that make rural Mexico look rich. And the worst we have done so far is to increase the incomes of African farmers by just under 3 times. We had 20,000 farmers in Malawi. We increased their incomes 576% in 1 year. So then all the people had all their kids in school. Then they were doing things that you now take for granted because you have universal primary education here. There has to be some physical presence in these rural areas, even if they're all electronically connected to a Laureate school or some other program. And if you want to keep some balance in population, and that's why more than half the world's people live in cities. More than 70% of the energy usage of the world is in cities now. And it's a good thing, but you probably want to think about what you need in balance particularly how much agricultural self-sufficiency you'd like to have and what you want to do about it. But I'm just saying, I've never been any place that couldn't be made a lot better if people had access to technology and information, capital to start enterprises, or some magnet nearby like this hospital I just described.
And along those lines, President Clinton, let me ask you, following these thoughts, a question dedicated mostly to students. There are several thousand students that are following this panel by internet. And the question would be, how could they best make a significant contribution to their communities? What would you tell them?
Well, the most important thing they can do is to get an education and become employable and be a productive member of society and take care of their families. Because when everyone has a job, the social problems decline dramatically. Then I believe that Mexico needs more partnerships between government and the private sector and non-governmental organizations who can help solve problems or create opportunities in the gap between what government can afford and the private sector can do and earn a profit. And I think that more and more young people are sensitive to that. They're interested in being part of the NGO movement, even if not full-time. But first and most important when you're young is to prepare yourself and become a productive member of society. Because if every person in Mexico could do that, we probably wouldn't be having this conference today. So that's the most important thing. Once you're settled on what you're doing with your own life, I think then you should begin to look around at the challenges other people face and try to organize partnerships to solve them.
Thank you, President. Doc, let me ask you to go back for a minute on your experience at Laureate regarding this recurrent issue throughout the day that had to do with multi-track programs as an answer of higher education institutions to many of these issues of interaction and effective vinculation to the productive, the so-called productive sector. Do you think these multi-track programs are a good answer to some of these needs?
Do you mean multi-track in education and vocational technical? I think it's critical, and it's an example of an innovation that works in many places. But I think all of these innovations, and I know that the people here that are engaged in solving problems, and certainly President Clinton and Luis Moreno, this is what you've done for your careers, is trying to solve big societal problems. We realize that these solutions create problems of their own. And so we know that, for example, community college, I totally agree that the U.S. community college is a great model. But I also know that the graduation rate from U.S. community colleges is terrible, but not all of them. And so you can then pick and choose and say, what are the characteristics of winning community colleges versus the ones that aren't so good? So we can learn from that. And one of the things that we try to do at Laureate, because we are in so many countries and we have almost 1 million students, we like the opportunity to advise and support government in trying to miss some of the natural errors that come from this. And I'll give you an example. Online education. The President mentioned it. Luis, you were discussing it as well. You made a great point, by the way, around the fact that you're looking for solutions that can scale. One of the problems with online education is there's a very, very low completion rate. So, for example, these MOOCs, like edX that you referenced, and they are a fantastic benefit to society, but the percentage of people that go all the way through to completion is less than 15%, and in some programs less than 5%. It takes so much self-motivation and drive and in order to complete all the way through. And in fact, in some cases, it takes actual support, academic support or other. And so I spend a lot of time thinking and talking to my colleagues in this field, what is a university? And when I look at the MOOC, which I think is a great thing, but it reminds me that there's so much more to a university than just the instruction. There is a lot of helping people, for example, pick a career which is going to give them a good job at the end, helping them pick a career that's a good match for them themselves, creating the advice and support which will keep them from giving up at the first sign of difficulty, providing them the academic support when they have a technical blockage of some kind. And as a result, we can show that we have high completion rates of our online programs, but there's a cost. There's no free lunch. You can provide the free MOOC, but very few people will finish, or you can provide the service and support, and very many people will finish at a higher cost. These are examples of where we're trying to document our experiences and then bring them to the service of the governments that we work with around the world. And the last point I'd make is the role of government is crucial. Online education, I was a passionate advocate for it, and I can't tell you how many times I would come to a country and my local team would say to me, Doug, that's really a great idea, but it's not permitted under the regulations that we operate in. And then we need to work with government, and government typically wants to solve that problem. It's not on purpose, but it's not easy to change the rules and the regulations. Here in Mexico, there's been good flexibility in certain aspects, but there probably still is a need for a broader regulatory framework for online that would be easier for people to use and to understand. And so in the spirit of engaging with government, the last point I'd make, and I never expected this, we would engage with government just to advise because it's good for society and they ask. Eventually, the governments would start saying to us, why don't you just do this? So I had a great experience, I remember telling you, Mr. President, where I went to advise the Saudi government on the launch of online education, and at the end of the very long conversation, they said, okay, great, thank you. That's not what we really want to talk about anymore. We actually want you to just build and run colleges for us in our country because the obstacles that are keeping us from making progress, we want to create demonstration of how those can be overcome. So today we actually operate 11 colleges in Saudi Arabia under direct contract from the government, with the purpose being the demonstration that the private sector and the public sector can truly partner together to solve these problems and to avoid the problems that are going to come from the solutions. So those have been great experiences for us so far.
And on these ideas, which I think are most important for education as well, of helping people understanding problems and finding solutions, I would like to ask you, what role do you see for the humanities and the arts on education? Many of us remember President Clinton many years ago when Carlos Fuentes and Gabriel Garcia Marquez told us a story of how impressed they were, because you were an active president at that time, that they realized that you had read most of their work and that you enjoy reading poetry and that you had developed a very delicate taste for classical music. So what place for that kind of leaderships that is so much needed and that the educational system has to form and develop? What role in these modern times for the humanities and the arts?
To be fair, when I had my first dinner with Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Carlos Fuentes, Marquez was more impressed with my 14-year-old daughter because she had read 3 of his books. And he said, no one 14 years old could understand his books. And she said, want to talk about them? And an hour later, they looked up. The following week, he sent her a signed copy of every book he'd written in English. And it began a wonderful friendship that ended only with his death. But anyway, look, I think this is important. I think it's really important. What happened to the community colleges, in part in America, though, is, and I feel responsible for this a little bit, because we had such a good economy in the 1990s. And the job market got so tight, the unemployment rate was so low, that the community colleges really began to see themselves as basically a less expensive way to get your first 2 years toward a 4-year university degree. And many of them drifted a little bit from their connection to the economy. And that, plus then the financial crisis and people worried about their cost of education, led to the problems that Doug just described. I would like to see even technical colleges have humanities offered at least as an option. I believe that it really matters, even if you're the greatest computer programmer in the world, whether you have the slightest idea about human nature and different cultures and how the economy affects ordinary people and what the challenges of dealing with people primarily in cyberspace are as opposed to face-to-face. I think this is all really important. But the point is that's, relatively speaking, not all that expensive, and I think it's important. The bigger problem in the modern world, and including in my country so far, is that the first problem, that we don't marry the economy with education and training enough. But I think it's a phony division between what is practical and useful and what is academic and stimulating. And I also believe that people who have the security of knowing they can get a decent job and build a family and a good life are more likely to have the security to go down and spend a little money on a book, either physically or online, and be participating in the whole rest of the life of the mind.
Thank you, President. Unfortunately, we're running short of time, so we still have a few minutes, which I would like to use, if you agree, to ask each of you for some final remarks, suggestions, or considerations. So let's start by the President of the Inter-American Development Bank, Luis Alberto Moreno. Your final remarks about this panel and about this journey.
Look, I think one of the biggest paradoxes that we see today in Latin America is that every analysis that is done about needs for jobs show that companies look, 50% of the companies that are polled looked at possibilities of hiring people, and they don't find the people with the skills to fill those jobs. That is the challenge. It is not as if there is a problem in the labor market, or rather to incorporate them. The problem is what President Clinton and Doug were mentioning, is the break that exists between the connection of the needs of business, or in other words, the skills to work. And here there are many examples. For instance, Chile, which has, as we know, 50% of its economy depends on mining, has basically begun to say, these are the jobs that these companies will need in the future. And that immediately invites people, not necessarily to become another doctor or another economist, but perhaps to learn an engineering job which he or she can fill in that regard. Equally, Colombia has done some of the same. The other issue is the balance that needs to exist between access and quality. You know, we have a lot of technical, take the case of English. You know, many places around Latin America have these technical schools that supposedly teach you English intensively in 3 months, and that's where people can go and put in their resume that they learned English, and probably what they learn is hello, goodbye, good morning. And that's a problem. So we need to really focus on that combination of access and quality.
Thank you, Luis Alberto. Doug, among other things, I would like to ask you before we end, what is your first reaction of this summit as compared with the previous, for instance, that took place in Madrid? Are we moving forward?
First, I have to say it's been such an exciting day for me to see the reaction of the audience, the panels, the concepts that have been discussed, and the commitment to make progress. We chose to do our last event, which the president was very involved in Spain at the absolute depths of the Spanish economic crisis. And so I think it's fair to say that the environment and the sense of the event, there was, I would say, even a higher sense of anxiety and urgency in addressing this issue. And it's nice to see Spain's economy beginning to improve, admittedly at a moment when Europe is beginning to look a little bit more difficult. I think actually there are many, many common threads between these two conferences. When I think about how to conclude, and I guess the main point I would make, I go back to this idea of how government and the private sector can work together. And the challenge is that we want the private sector to play a role because that's where the jobs are going to be, and because private sector institutions can deliver great results. We saw this. I was very excited and proud to see the results of this IFC study that Mac was so nice to present earlier today. We know it can make a difference. On the other hand, we also know that the private sector institutions in many places, in many parts of the world, can be lacking in quality, not delivering the results that are expected, or in some cases benefiting from government support and not earning their participation in it. So I think what's really needed is a real interface between the private sector and government, where the government sees private sector as having a role to play, and then holds the private sector very accountable for results. And if there's one thing that we've tried to do in our own case is to make sure that we're always meeting or exceeding the expectations, measurable expectations. We were talking earlier about Brazil. Brazil has a terrific system of assessing the graduates of all universities. Okay, Mexico does that as well. But then in Brazil, they actually give private universities more privileges, such as expanding, launching new programs, if they have good scores, and they reduce their privileges if they have bad scores. So there's real consequences that holds the private sector accountable. I think that part of why I haven't seen as much engagement with the private sector here in Mexico is that I think the government doesn't want to be disappointed, because there are many, the patitos, the small private institutions that aren't living up to their potential. If the government is prepared to hold people accountable for measurable results, I think then they could see really great impact on these issues of productivity, employability, social mobility, all of the topics of today's presentation.
Thanks a lot, Doc. President Clinton, your final remarks, which will be the final remarks of this panel, please.
Well, first of all, thank you for doing this and for the work that is done at this university. And the results of the study on productivity were really hopeful. All over the world, there is a job crisis, especially for the young and for the unprepared. All over the world, intelligence and the willingness to work hard are evenly distributed. Most really poor people have to work harder than the rest of us. They are not lazy. If you look at the economic crisis in Greece today, it might surprise you to know that the average Greek works 25% longer per week than the average German. So human potential is a precious resource, more or less evenly distributed, and thwarted by culture, upbringing, difficulties at home, bad government, absence of economic opportunity. You could think of 1,000 things. But you come here because you don't want to make excuses, you want to make progress. So I would say this. I do think government makes a big difference in the framework of what is possible. And you should continue working on government capacity. I'll just give you one example. I saw several of you nodding your heads up and down when Luis said that there were lots of openings for jobs and people couldn't find people properly trained. It's a big problem in America. We are filling posted job openings at half the rate of previous post-recessionary areas. We have 5 million job openings in America today. So it's not a problem unique to you. Therefore, one of the things I would look at from government and from the national business organizations is how good is your data on this nationwide? How well does it break down by state? How well does it break down by community? I would share that data with every institution of higher education. I would identify the job openings where there are any significance in numbers in a given place and try to get representatives of those kinds of jobs heavily involved in the local institutions. I think that's important. But the other thing I would do is to think about what you'd like Mexico to look like in 10 years. And never forget how far you have come. This is a country of astonishingly gifted people. And a lot of you have, I mean, I would have preferred to sit in that audience and listen to all of you come out here and give 10 or 15 minutes. And it took me a long time to get here from the airport today. 20 minutes longer than I thought. But I was marveling at the difference in how the city looks now and how it did when I first came here as a very young man. Don't forget that. You have everything you need here. I know you're frustrated. I wish you had no narco trafficking. But it's not really your fault. Basically, we did too good a job of taking the transportation out of the air and water, and so we ran it overland. I apologize for that. I wish you didn't have any problems. Everybody's got problems. Don't forget your assets. Well, every time I drive by a park in Mexico City or I breathe the air and I remember what it used to be like, it reminds me that there's nothing you can't do. I'll just give you one thing you ought to think about. There's a lot of talk today in Mexico about how you're one of the countries that can't possibly be happy that oil is under $50. But your production has been cut by a third, just in the natural course of things, and you're exporting barely more than half your oil. You have just scratched the surface of what you could be doing with solar, wind, geothermal. You close one big landfill here in Mexico City. You could close every landfill in every city in Mexico and generate power out of that and reclaim lots of land for housing or education or recreational space. If I were you, in a period of cheap oil, no one else will do this. In countries with cheap oil, I would accelerate the transformation away from an oil-based economy to a clean energy economy so you can export all the oil that you're drilling. And then you could train more people, and then you could create a heck of a lot of jobs, you know, in a whole different area, both in the transformation to clean energy and those people involved in the export business. You need to just keep thinking about things like that and bring it back to the education system. I have no idea how good your data is on posted job openings for which there are not qualified people. But I would spend some money on getting very good data out on a certainly no less than a quarterly basis, but better on a monthly basis. And I would close that gap in how long it takes when someone wants to hire and someone actually hires. You can do that, and you can get people like Doug to orient their whole programs around making sure it happens. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, President Clinton. Thank you very much, President Moreno. Thank you very much, President Becker. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention. It has been a distinct privilege to serve as moderator of this outstanding panel. Good afternoon.